Hi, this is Paul. Damian Walter a couple days ago released a video called James Bond in 2025 is a Problem. And anybody who's sort of been watching the culture would know exactly why James Bond is a problem. The rest is history. A while ago, did a couple of shows about Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond. James Bond is a womanizer. He's a killer, but he's also a hero. And this gets into the question of, well, what is a hero? And what do we make of heroes? And how can we sort of plot the changes in culture by heroes? Now, those of you who've been around the channel for a while know that James Bond versus High Noon was really a wonderful thing, wonderful idea that Dr. Jim brought to us. And maybe I'll drop that video in here.
And then I'm looking at this recent, let's say, domination of a certain kind of storytelling. And I'm seeing that something in the tradition that I am very familiar with is missing. It's not really there. And now I'm going to try to describe that thing that I think is missing. I played in my mind a couple of ways of trying to introduce this, and I think perhaps the simplest way is the Western. I studied Westerns for a while, about 10 or 15 years ago, and High Noon is kind of a classically structured Western. It's a 50s Western by a guy named Howard Hawks. And it's a very simple story. There's a sheriff. He is getting married to the pure girl from the East who arrives in town. She's a school teacher. He's going to get married to her, and he's going to give up his sheriff job because he's cleaned up the town and everything's hunky-dory, and he's going to ride off into the sunset with his new bride. And right at the beginning of the movie, the guy he put in jail 7 years ago or so has been unjustly let out of jail and is coming to town. He's going to recreate the bad world that the sheriff had cleaned up. And in the midst of it, he's going to kill the sheriff. His goal is revenge against the sheriff. And the story plays out, in somewhat complicated ways that aren't important to the point I'm trying to make. But of course, the wedding is off. He's now the sheriff again. And no one wants to help him, but the story builds to the point where there's the showdown. Of course, it's at High Noon, and there's complications between him and the woman along the way. But in the end, right near the end of the movie, mano a mano in the street, sheriff kills the villain and rides up the school teacher, his bride. He throws down the sheriff's star, and they ride out of town. And that's the end of the movie. Now, that's the thing. The end of that is the thing that I think is missing and has kind of fallen off the map of storytelling recently. And I want to give that thing a little bit more flesh. It's what I want to call a generative arena. It's a circumstance in which the acting out of that world is building the future. It's possibility, and it's a kind of a stable place looking out into an open future. And of course, it's symbolized by a man and a woman and the potential for them to have children. And so that image would change the U-shaped journey of the hero, because it would put the end to be not really an end or the circle that Campbell has, but rather a destination. There would be a real destination there, maybe a plateau that is reached. And that's the goal. That's the telos of that story, of that narrative.
Right.
I'm going to start with James Bond.
Okay.
Because you look at a standard James Bond flick, and it's got almost the exact structure, right?
Yep.
There's James Bond. He's an MI6. He's there flirting with what's her name, and he's a smart guy. He's a great fighter. He's all that. And the crisis. We've got a villain, and he charges out to fight the villain. Bad things happen, obstacles. Alongside is this Bond girl. Oh, there she is, the Bond girl. She's there. She's with him. He's he's not gonna make it. He's trapped. The fates are against him. Whatever. Oh, overcome the obstacles, destroy the villain, and there's he and the Bond girl in the love nest at the end of the film. And he's so involved in this, relationship that he doesn't even take the congratulations from MI6, as they call, or whatever. It's a classic ending, right? But James Bond is not a father, and the Bond girl is not a mother. That's not part of who they are. And I don't even, someone might say, well, maybe they'll go off again. But no, it's the structure of the narrative, the structure of the character is that they are not that person, in fact. And so there is no generativity there. And what there is eternal recurrence. The only thing that can happen, and obviously did happen on a repeated basis, is that Bond shakes himself off after his tryst and he goes back to MI6 and he flirts with the girl behind the desk and a new villain pops up and off we go again. And, this is a kind of a flat world. The world has nothing really in it except a Bond character at a given age. This is an ageless character, or he has no youth and he has no old age, although the guy who's playing him gets older as he goes on, but the character himself is frozen. This is a static and essentially sterile world. And you can have the ecstatic, individual effort, heroic, experiential, kind of seeking out thrills and seeking out experience. That's not necessarily wrong intrinsically, as long as it's got the right telos.
Right.
And in the end, that telos is the generative future. Right.
And see, this was part of, when I was talking about the hero's journey, what I've seen is that in many ways that, Peterson and many others are framing the hero's journey as a story of self-actualization.
Exactly.
And it's, and certainly there is self-actualization that happens, but that I think is part of the blindness of individualism. And what you actually have in a fuller, better, bigger story that I think we find finally more satisfying is that there's self-realization, self-actualization going on in Sam, in Frodo, but now Frodo and Bilbo's self-actualization is finally in some ways, sacrificial. Now they go off into the gray havens, with the elves.
Right.
But it's, there's a longing and a mourning. And even though in some ways in that universe, the elves are going back to they're returning home. In some ways, the elves in Middle Earth were colonials.
It seems to me like Tolkien's kind of not quite wanting to frame exactly what that is supposed to be. I mean, but it clearly is this it's not like it would be right to end the movie with Frodo living in the house next door to Sam with his
wife and child.
That would not be the end. That was not the correct end.
Right. So James Bond doesn't give us a generative future the way that the hero of High Noon does. The hero of High Noon Gary Cooper will go off with Grace Kelly, and we assume we'll have lots of little children. Now, Gary Cooper is significantly older than Grace Kelly, so we'll hear a little bit of commentary about that, but not too much commentary about that. I really enjoyed Damien's conversation about this, and let's listen to some of it.
Fundamentally interests me is the search for the 21st century mythos. And so I'm interested in talking about stories which are part of our 21st century mythos. And Bond, certainly a very, very big part of that. He is our modern day hero. We have a problem with heroes in the 21st century, which we'll get into. Because really...
Now, this is going to cross with the video I didn't have near enough time dealing with yesterday. All right, let's pick up where we left off on this video.
To be clear, as Klein also adds, it's not so much individuals that are the problem here. Rather, it's the bureaucratic institutions and procedural dogmas that have arisen around them, and that over time went from being a safeguard into what feels more like a prison.
Now, in case you missed yesterday's video, I forget the guy's name who does like stories of old. He's read Ezra Klein's Abundance, and so he uses quite a few quotes from Abundance, and he's clearly processing Ezra Klein's Abundance with what he calls the death of Hollywood's liberal fantasy. Fantasy is going to be an important word as we continue to get into the James Bond thing, what I called it the increasing impotence of liberal storytelling.
Well-meaning laws to protect nature in the 20th century now block the clean energy projects needed in the 21st. Klein continues in another example. And laws meant to ensure that government considers the consequences of its actions have made it too difficult for government to act consequentially.
I'm sorry, I know you mean well. You just didn't think it through. You want to protect the world, but you don't want it to change.
All this, in turn, has resulted in the supposedly progressive liberalism becoming little more than a defender of the status quo, which is also the title of an interesting video from the pop culture detective about the Marvel superhero movies, which, as he argues, have reflected this problem for quite a while. For while the Avengers have always been ready to use their powers to protect the world from external dangers, on closer examination, it is also true that we don't really see them use those same powers to create meaningful progress.
Now, if you go way back when we talked about the Watchmen, because the Watchmen gets into this. The Watchmen gets into, the Watchmen comics gets into the fact that, well, these superheroes, they don't really engage with sort of the normal narratives in terms of how the world is either trying to progress or conserve or what it's trying to do. This brings in, now it's interesting because when Damien Walter is looking at, okay, who would be the supervillains of today? Oh, Bezos. Well, he just bought James Bond. Maybe Elon Musk.
Ozymandias is Adrian Veidt, another retired hero, said to be the smartest man on Earth. Veidt is a super ambitious, super rich, super arrogant dude who wants to be like Alexander the Great and like the Egyptian pharaohs. His dream is to unite the world under his design. Veidt realized that superheroes couldn't save the world from nuclear war, so instead he hatched a crazy plan. He put a bunch of scientists and artists on a secret island and genetically engineered a giant psychic squid monster. He kills the comedian when the comedian finds out his plan, and he uses a cancer hoax to get rid of Manhattan, and he frames Rorschach to get him locked up, and he hires an assassin on himself to throw off suspicion, and finally he teleports the squid into New York, killing 3 million people to make it look like aliens attacked, to scare the world into ending the Cold War, to unite humanity and bring peace on Earth. It's a crazy supervillain plan, and it actually succeeds. America and Russia are so freaked out by the supposed alien that they make a peace deal. As for Rorschach and Manhattan and Dan and Laurie, they fail to prevent Ozymandias killing millions, so much for superheroes. Ozymandias saves the world not by punching anyone, and not with superhuman powers, but by science and determination, and a psychopathic willingness to kill 3 million people. Ozymandias saves the world at a terrible cost. So is he...
And this gets into this whole question that we're sort of picking at with the Peter Thiel stuff about, well, what exactly is world saving? Is it individual transformation? And, because now we're looking at, if I say individual transformation, we think in all of these things, we think about, well, I'll be a better person. Or is it transitioning? Well, it's transitioning now. We have all these other resonances that sort of flood in. Let's go back to this one.
Extremely rare to see our favorite superheroes engaging in any larger socio-political projects that push society forward.
Okay, now right there, too, larger socio-political projects. So now you've got this question of, well, what arena of transformation is actually important for the greater good, or the eschaton, or the sum of all things, or, again, if religion is that which is highest and how we get there, well, there's, you know, the fact that all of these superheroes are basically just status quo people. They are the firefighters who are on call whenever we have things like a supervillain emerges or we have space invaders attacking.
The video refers to a great essay from David Graeber, who wrote that these heroes are purely reactionary in the literal sense. They have no projects of their own, at least not in their role as heroes. Almost never do superheroes make, create, or build anything. The villains, in contrast, are endlessly creative.
If you believe in peace, then let us keep it.
I think you're confusing peace with quiet.
Indeed, it certainly feels like every time a hero actually does aspire to do something more monumental, it is bound to turn into a cautionary tale instead, as the project somehow becomes evil, or a dangerous weapon.
Someone will figure out a way to make this power source into a nuclear weapon.
But it gets worse.
And so, of course, then when everybody listens to Peter Thiel talking, well, we've been conditioned by all of these superhero and comic book movies to say, oh, look, it's a supervillain, and hey, I get it. I was listening to Damon Walters. Damon Walter is fun to listen to when I go on my walks because he's usually on his walk too, and so it's almost like I'm having a little walk with Damon Walter. I'm hearing his thoughts, and I get to hear him for 20 or 30 minutes straight. It's like, I have thoughts, and now I'm going to make my thoughts, and I'm going to put them on my video, and maybe I do them sitting down because I add all of these things. And I thought, what would it be like to write a movie or a script or a book where, let's say, the Allies are planning to firebomb Dresden, and the German spy foils the plot and saves hundreds of thousands of German citizens from the firebombing that the Allies are going to do? Is that person a hero? Or maybe some Japanese spy is going to foil the Manhattan Project, and the lives of everyone from Nagasaki and Hiroshima will be saved, and the atomic bomb project is pushed back a number of years. Is that person a hero? How do we watch these stories?
Because, as Professor Nicholas Bagley adds in his essay from the Michigan Law Review, excessive proceduralism doesn't just hinder new progress from being made, it is also more likely to hurt the status quo as it is by making it more vulnerable to abuse from bad faith actors, and by slowly eroding the public trust over time.
Things are worse than ever!
It has become the central dogma of administrative law. Bagley writes, strict procedural rules are both essential to agency legitimacy and necessary to guarantee public accountability. That dogma is false. Many well-intentioned efforts to promote good governance can, and do, drain agencies of their legitimacy, impair their responsiveness to the public, and expose to have become the inadvertent and unlucky mascot of this regressive liberal complacency. As a black man who became the new Captain America, the character seems to be stuck in a perpetual crisis of identity as he visibly struggles with a slowly worsening status quo, with a society plagued by rising international tensions, institutional racism, and increasingly corrupt structures of power.
This is bullshit and you know it. This is politics. So you better wise up, son.
But at the same time, he is also incapable of truly doing anything about them. Because again, if he were to take action to change that status quo, even when it's clearly worsening and on the verge of collapse, well, that's just a slippery slope towards evil, towards ending up as the villain yourself. And so, how does any liberal hero, still seem so proactively engaged? What actual power do they still have? Well, This secret weapon, this ultimate solution to proclaiming radical change while also maintaining a pristine conscience, is revealed right.
There you go. Radical change, pristine conscience. You have to make radical change, but no eggs can be broken. Now, if I use that metaphor, everyone's thinking about Stalin. Oh, if you want to make an omelet, you've got to break some eggs. But who are the eggs that are going to get broken? And so here we see the bindings against, no, we see that this rampant proceduralism, well, that just becomes a tax on everything. And a la Ezra Klein, you can't accomplish anything great anymore. Not even the great things that are supposed to save us from all the tiny little things that we're drowning in whatever framework you want to do it. So where are you left?
Here.
The only power I have is that I believe we can do better.
Liberal fantasy trope.
You look
3.
to me to speak. I know not what to say other than we have all known too much death.
There are many things wrong with the movie Gladiator 2, which I already made an in-depth video about. But in the context of this discussion, what struck me the most was how, if you put it next to the original from 25 years ago, it captures quite tellingly the progression, or rather the regression of the Hollywood liberal fantasy that brought us to where we are today. Let me explain.
And after your glorious coup, what then? You'll take your 5,000 warriors and leave?
I will leave.
In the first Gladiator movie, there's an interesting conversation that isn't often talked about, but that now feels remarkably revealing. After meeting up in secret with a Roman senator, Maximus lays out his plan to overthrow Commodus and give Rome back to the people.
This is madness.
The senator, however, is wary of the idea of, as he puts it, trading one dictatorship for another, to which Maximus replies,
"The time for half measures and talk is over, Senator."
Narratively speaking, it's not a particularly significant.
Now, of course, if you look back in Rome, what happens is that, well, you overthrow Commodus by killing him. The Julian Claudians go down with Nero, and then you have this period of unsettled, and then the Flavians will come up and rule for a time, and it's the succession of, well, this is how, in a majority of case, power is transferred by killing the guy in power, or killing his children, or killing his son, or armies killing other people. And, of course, Rome was just a history of civil war after civil war after civil war, and this just continues on century after century after century, to which democracy tries to say, well, can we do this without the blood? Let's just all decide and count hands instead of killing each other, and let's have a limited amount of time with it, so that if we get somebody we really don't like, we'll all raise our hands again, and out they go, and someone else will come in, and we'll try it over and over, and then off we go. But we can do better. Jump ahead a little bit.
Commodus, he would briefly have to become like him, become essentially a tyrant, like the situation looks like from the stranger's perspective. Because what Maximus plans to do here is actually a violent and therefore potentially dangerous claim to power. In some ways, it can even be argued that in order to defeat Commodus, he would briefly have to become like him, become essentially a tyrant, a rogue agent who slays the sitting emperor and forcefully seizes the city for himself.
Once all of Rome is yours, you'll just give it back to the people.
The soldiers will stay for your protection under the command of the Senate.
Of course, this plan fails and Maximus ends up defeating Commodus in a more legitimate way. But still, I'm pretty sure that even if it had gone as originally intended, audiences would have cheered Maximus on just as much. Which is an interesting point to consider because, jumping ahead to Gladiator 2 and jumping ahead more than 2 decades of evolving liberal thought, it's this kind of direct action taking, or the less literal version of it, just the broader idea of letting go of that moral purity and being able to mobilize oneself behind imperfect schemes and alliances to achieve one's end. That now feels completely unthinkable.
I don't fight for power. I fight to free Rome from men like you and to return it to them.
Today, instead of consciously turning the will to power into a purposeful, albeit conflicted call to action like Maximus did, one that is focused on actually trying to achieve something, Our new hero Lucius more or less stumbles his way to the finale without real direction. To be fair, he does kill his nemesis, but then again, here it doesn't really feel like a morally complicated act. Not in the way that it would have in the original if Maximus had carried out his original plan. That kind of will to power is reserved for the villain.
Okay, and now we're into this will to power. And for those of you, now when I talk about the corner, I mean this little corner, I mean this little flotilla of other channels that are sort of around. And they often list on my videos and they talk about it, and there's other characters talking about it. And the Almighty Ohm has been talking about Nietzsche with Luke Thompson. Because this will to power, well, is this the libido dominandi that Augustine writes about of Rome. And of course, Augustine was far closer to Rome than we are, because Augustine just says this avaricious power. I've been watching Palm Royale and Apple Plus, which is really delightful in that it's the shadow matriarchy fighting for power with each other. It's been quite an interesting show to watch. But as I mentioned in the last video, this word power, this tiny little word, but we mean so many different things by it, because of course, well, here the gladiator wants to kill Commodus, the tyrant, and give it back to the people. But what exactly is the people, and what form will the people have? Well, I'm going to give it to a senator. Well, now why didn't you say you're going to give it to a senator? You said the people because that sounded high-minded and that sounded wonderful. And those of us who are ardent Democrats say, yes, the people. We like our little bloodless coups where we raise our hand or we check off or we hit the thing and we vote. And one party goes in and the other party goes out. And now we've got two parties, so they just kind of switch back and forth. And we're not terribly happy with either one, but somebody makes a play to say, I'll break the deadlock, and I'll break the avarice, and I'll break the things, and I'll finally bring the eschaton into the world. And so whether it's change or draining the swamp or making America great again or whatever it is, this is the perpetual fantasy. Now again, remember this word fantasy, because we're going to come back to it.
Order. I must have power.
Who here is less of a complicated antagonist with complicated desires like Commodus was, and instead mainly seems to function as a personification of liberalism's worst fear.
Because this is what they believe in. Power.
There has to be another Rome.
There is no other Rome.
So what does Lucius do instead? How does he still end up becoming a savior like Maximus was and getting everyone to cheer for him? Well, this is where we get to the big speech.
Getting everyone to cheer for him, because that's sort of, well, isn't that sort of democracy gained, getting everyone to cheer for him? And then, well, because you could kill the last guy, you must be a good person to have rule, because again, well, you don't want it. Well, maybe there are qualities that you had and exhibited in being able to kill the last guy that means that you cannot be killed, or that you can kill your enemies, or that, and suddenly this narrative that we have, and that has tended to run through all of our movies, that what we need is selective violence. And with that selective violence that is applied at the right time and right place, and particularly to the right people, well, then the world can be set right.
For me to speak.
The grand moment in which our liberal hero stands up to speak loudly, inspirationally, and most importantly, only abstractly.
A city for the many and a refuge for those in need. A home worth fighting for.
At first,
and of course, we've taken a lot of Christianity and forced it back there into Rome. No Christians. I haven't seen Gladiator 2, so but no Christians there. They're not going to pick up. But our vision of the eschaton, of what is good, of what is highest, this religious vision, well,
plans, this may seem like a mostly harmless retread of the first movie. The bad guy is dead and the dream of Rome can be realized again. But look more closely to how both endings play out. Like, what's the actual content in Lucius's speech? In the original, it was so clear what had been achieved at the end, and what the next steps would be.
Free my men. Senator Gracchus is to be reinstated.
Also note the tone here, which is just a quiet set of directions really.
There was a dream that was wrong. It shall be realized.
This is all that we needed because we in the audience already perfectly understood the plan of action. We already knew what Maximus's claim to power would look like. In other words, the real work had already been done.
In other words, we had a script. And scripts really make us feel better. When we have a script, part of how we feel so disturbed right now is that, again, we almost feel like we've come to the end of the script. We've come to the end of history. And so, well, what? And this is sort of the problem with that Ezra Klein points out in Abundance. Well, let's have high-speed rail, and let's and also, you have the same thing with Peter Thiel. Well, where are the flying cars? And why in Back to the Future don't we have what Back to the Future imagined we would have by 2015? And, well, then maybe hell is now and the decadence that we're in. And a lot of people are like, wait a minute, I think hell is not change, or at least tiny, small, selective change. If I could put time in a bottle, Jim Croce.
But now look again at the sequel. What does tomorrow look like here? Who's going to be in charge? What are they going to do?
But dare we rebuild that dream together?
It's just deliberately vague. There's no plan of action, no real desire to take action, no concrete steps towards anything, really. It's
now again, as well, I should just play it.
And so we can define our terms out the gate. But I think before we even do that, you picked up on something there about what was going wrong that formed a community like TLC to form in the first place. It's pretty clear that TLC is downstream from the IDW.
Mm-hmm.
And the IDW clearly formed as a classical liberal reaction to an illiberal direction that had been taken by the progressive left in the movement that came to be known as woke.
And of course, the illiberal movement, because, well, as Tim Keller said, and I can drop that right in here.
This is hard. So let me give you the best answer I can. Liberal democracy, which is how I'm using the word liberal very broadly. Liberal democracy, which is how our Constitution was written, how our country was founded, was the idea that the government is neutral when it comes to religion and religious beliefs. It does not impose religion and religious beliefs on people. It doesn't impose a worldview on people. It doesn't say, it doesn't hook up to Catholicism or Lutheranism or whatever. And therefore, it's big on freedom of association, freedom of speech. It's a pluralistic society, so you have Jews and Catholics and various kinds of Protestants and atheists, and it doesn't impose a worldview or religious views on people, and or moral values on people. And it came out of the Enlightenment because the Enlightenment was born a couple hundred years before America in the wars of religion, when everybody was fighting. Basically, people were dying as to which religion my country is going to be. And a lot of the thinkers of Europe came up and said, hey, you know what? Let's create a society in which there's no one religion that is the official religion. And we are coming together just as reasonable people, and we decide how we want to live together. And we park our religion at the door when we come into the public realm, and we make laws based on, common good and that kind of thing. And for a very long time, that worked in America. And I just want you to know that that's the problem. The big problem is that liberal democracy is in crisis. And the reason it's in crisis is because, and here's the irony, and I don't think I think I could trace this out if I was writing something down. I think it would be a little hard orally right now to do it. But weirdly enough, liberal democracy kind of led to the decline of religion, probably. Because it really said, religion is okay for your private life, but when it comes to the public life, we really don't need it. It's really not important. We just use science and reason to figure out how we're going to live. And you park your religion at the door when we come out here and talk together. Whether you're a Jew or a Catholic or a Muslim or a Christian or an atheist, you come together and we just decide this. And it was part of I think what weakened faith, because it was really saying faith is a private thing. It just makes you happy, but it really isn't all that necessary for how you live your whole life. Whatever. But the fact is that when religion started to decline, the thing that now, I have some atheist friends who admit this, say the thing that actually held us together was not freedom of speech, freedom of association, using our reason. What held us together was like 80% of the population went to either a Catholic or a Protestant church. They actually went. And that even though, the liberals and conservatives in Congress were arguing over taxes or unions, but they would never argue over same-sex marriage. They all thought it would be a horrible thing. In other words, everybody was and 80-90% of people were nominal Christians. And because they were nominal Christians, they had a moral base, and they lived with the illusion that we're really not a Christian country, we're a secular country. But the fact is they'd never really had to deal with pluralism using liberal democratic structure. And when real pluralism came along, we found out we couldn't abide it. And so now here's the first thing that happened. The first group of people that actually moved away from liberal democracy into we're going to impose our worldview on you were the progressives. They were the first people to start doing it. Rowan Williams, Archbishop of Canterbury, former, he calls it programmatic secularism rather than procedural secularism. In other words, it used to be the government was secular in the sense of being a neutral umpire and said, okay, we want to make sure everybody has a level playing field to make your case and live your lives. But programmatic secularism goes like this. Put it this way. In the 60s and 70s, even the 50s, if somebody wrote a book saying it's okay to be gay, that would probably be not publishable because it would be banned as obscene speech, right? Today, if you try to write a book or say it's not okay to be gay, now it's also condemned as obscene speech, except it's called hate speech. And what's happened is there was a kind of hegemony. It wasn't pluralistic. There was a kind of nominal Christian hegemony that really did run things. And when that fell apart, now we realize, well, who's going to get in charge of defining hate speech and obscene speech? And progressives said, we're going to do it. And so what they actually have done is they are imposing a kind of programmatic, hard secularism. And conservatives and Christians have seen that. They say, you know what, you're not being neutral anymore. You're really actually pushing. You're actually saying you have to keep your religion totally, totally private, when our religion doesn't allow that. Now, by the way, it's the same problem with Islam. So they're going to have, the more Muslims that are here, the more problems they're going to have there too. But the issue is that conservatives are pushing back, wrongly, I think, and are saying, yeah, liberal democracy doesn't work. There's a lot of conservatives saying we need Christian nationalism. We actually need to get, the state needs to be overtly Christian, overtly Protestant, or there needs to be, the Catholic integralists say that the Catholic Church should be the state church. And what they're saying is there's absolutely no way to get that moral consensus. We're always going to be fragmented. Liberal democracy doesn't work. And it is a crisis, because the fact is, as long as everybody was a nominal Christian, liberal democracy works, and it doesn't. We're not that anymore. Liberal democracy undermined Christianity and religion in general, and created this situation where we truly are divided. And now the old liberal democratic proceduralism doesn't bring us together. We're just at each other's throats. We have alternate views of reality, totally different views of reality. And I don't have a good way forward. I mean, if you were asking me that question, I'm not going to answer it because I'm actually thinking it out. I still think liberal democracy is way better than Catholic integralism or Protestant Christian nationalism. But I also feel like you've got to call out the progressives, to say this, what you consider democracy actually isn't. It is actually an imposition of your worldview on us. So I feel like we have to call both sides out. But when I do that, I am, maybe Carrie, I am called both sidism, playing, or being, trying to be apolitical when you can't be. I don't think that's possible. But I do think it's fair to say, sorry, right and left, I don't know what the alternative is, but what you are proposing is absolutely wrong. Will never really work.
Someone said we must break the end of history. We've clearly not arrived at everything that we were hoping it would fulfill. And it's time for action.
Yes. The reason we all hated woke was because it was illiberal.
Yes.
That's why we didn't like it.
Yes.
So how does it make any sense to pursue a remedy to the problems we were reacting to in woke by having more illiberalism but from a different political direction?
One might even say a woke right.
Right, exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Just a virtue signaling display of intent, a bland suggestion of rebuilding some nebulous dream of a more liberal world. Basically, it's just a different way of saying,
The only power I have is that I believe we can do better.
And this is exactly what separates Gladiator 1 from Gladiator 2. This is the fatal flaw at the heart of the liberal fantasy. Not the belief that we can do better, but the belief that this is the only power we have, when in reality it's just the only one we're willing to employ.
The only power we have is the belief that we can do better.
It implies that all we need is to have the right message. That the mere expression of wanting a more liberal world is both righteous and consequential.
My brother Cardinal.
This is how the least ambitious cardinal could become pope after a few thoughtful words. How Robert De Niro could dismantle the complex problem of conspiracism with a simple speech.
Bullshit conspiracy nonsense.
And how Sam can seemingly end any conflict with a good talking down of his enemy.
You've got to do better, Senator. You've got to step up.
This is how we can proclaim radical action without actually doing anything. How we can passively witness the world crumbling around us while telling ourselves that we're doing everything within our power to stop it. This is how we can lose it all while insisting that...
It's not easy to see something that's never been before. The good world.
And this is sort of where Peter Thiel comes in.
Conformist. Maybe that's not the kind of smartness that's going to make a difference.
So do you fear then a plausible future where AI in a way becomes itself stagnationist? That it's like highly intelligent, creative in a conformist way. It's like, the Netflix algorithm. It makes infinite okay movies that people watch. It generates infinite okay ideas. It puts a bunch of people out of work and makes them obsolete. But it does.
In other words, there's sort of the idea that the liberal vision that doesn't seem to have a script much into the future. Now, of course, the liberal script was, at least the liberationist script was, well, let's stop subjugating black people and Jews and Catholics, at least in America. And maybe Catholics would just stop subjugating them over in Europe where the Catholics have power. And because equality was sort of, the March on Washington. Well, maybe we can arrive at colorblindness. But of course, we got to the point when, that wasn't enough. We need to, again, once the script ended, we need to be illiberal. And so then we should go back but okay, so we're gonna head back from the illiberal, but is that just stagnation?
it like deepens stagnation in some way. Is that a fear?
It's
like people just outsource.
It's quite possible that's certainly a risk, but I guess where I end up is I still think we should be trying AI, and that the alternative is just total stagnation. So yeah, there's sort of all sorts of interesting things going to happen with, okay, maybe drones in a military context are combined with AI, and okay, this is kind of scary or dangerous or dystopian, or it's going to change things. But if you don't have AI, wow, there's just nothing going on.
So when Miss Frizzle says, take chances, break things, well, that's okay because it's all the kids on the carpet. But when a billionaire says, we need to take more risks, it's like, who exactly is going to be at risk with this risk taking? Because, statistics are lovely, but when it's in a sample of one and the one is me, well.
And I don't know, there's like a version of this discussion on the internet where, did the internet lead to more conformity and more wokeness? And yeah, there are all sorts of ways where it didn't lead to quite the cornucopian, diverse explosion of ideas that libertarians fantasized about in 1999. But counterfactually, I would argue that it was still better than the alternative, that if we hadn't had the internet, maybe it would have been worse. AI is better. It's better than the alternative, and the alternative is nothing at all. Because here's one place where the stagnationist arguments are still reinforced. The fact that we're only talking about AI, I feel, is always an implicit acknowledgement that but for AI, we are like in almost total stagnation.
But the world of AI is clearly filled with people who, at the very least, seem to have a more utopian, transformative, whatever word you want to call it, view of the technology than you're expressing here, right? And you were mentioned earlier the idea that the modern world used to promise radical life extension and doesn't anymore. It seems very clear to me that a number of people deeply involved in artificial intelligence see it as a kind of mechanism for transhumanism, for transcendence of our mortal flesh, and either some kind of creation of a successor species or some kind of merger of mind and machine. And do you think that's just all kind of irrelevant fantasy? Or do you think it's just hype? Do you think people are trying to raise money by pretending that we're going to build a machine god, right? Is it hype? Is it delusion? Is it something you worry about? I think you would prefer the human race to endure, right? You're hesitating.
Yeah, well,
yes?
I don't know. I would.
This is a long hesitation. This is a long hesitation.
There's so many questions implicit in this.
Should the human race survive?
Yes.
Okay.
But I also would.
And then he's going to talk about transitioning and transforming, and we played that before.
What made the narrator descent into tyranny so particularly frustrating wasn't just that the writers had her perform this sudden act of evil that was completely out of character for her, but also how afterwards they tried to gaslight the audience into believing that the signs had been there all along, that all of this was inevitable from the start, and that we were just fools for having ever thought otherwise.
When she murdered the slavers of Astapor, sure no one but the slavers complained. After all, they were evil men.
This is just
They came for the slavers and we didn't say anything.
Such nonsense, because what it suggests is that the content of her beliefs never mattered, just the form of it. It tries to convince us that her past usage of violence to bring an end to the institution of slavery isn't meaningfully different from, let's say, Cersei wiping out an entire church full of innocent people.
Everywhere she goes, evil men die, and we cheer her for it.
In her video on the show, Lindsay Ellis already explained it best.
The argument Tyrion is making is that if someone has the power, with enough encouragement and enough self-reassurance, and if they believe in their cause enough, this sort of thing is inevitable, isn't it? The righteousness of your beliefs don't really matter. What matters is the strength of those beliefs, and that's what's dangerous, and that's what you have to watch out for.
What is so insidious here?
Ah, the strengths of your belief. She just basically said Return of the Strong Gods are Reno's thesis. That's it. What we need to do is to maintain the status quo, this stability that Peter Thiel is worried about. Maybe the stagnation is an achievement. And now, of course, Peter Thiel and Eric Weinstein would say, of course it's an achievement and it must be smashed. Okay, into what? Well, I don't know. Take chances, break things, do stuff.
Is that it basically robs any serious aspiration towards a better world from its validity. It makes immediately suspicious any vision of radical change. And after having broken down liberalism's strained relationship with their will to power and their hesitance to take consequential action in favor of abstract posturing, this feels like the final nail in the coffin. The inability to dream, the fear of even imagining what could be.
Each day is more grey than the one before, as the world slowly dies.
This we also see reflected in the many stories that imagine the future as some kind of dystopian nightmare or apocalyptic wasteland, which from a more right-wing or libertarian perspective are probably most compelling because they tend to capture what they generally see as the true nature of humanity. A selfish or at best tribalistic creature in a world where everyone only looks out for themselves and their own. But from a more liberal point of view, it feels like these bleak visions resonate mainly because they reflect their kind of ingrained pessimism. The strangely conservative idea that our best days are behind us, that the world's only going to get worse, and therefore that the only real course of action we have, the only real focus of our dreams and aspirations, is the preservation of what little we have left.
Because really, what's left to hope for?
In other words, it's not just that liberalism sort of accidentally became a defender of the status quo through an unwillingness to take action, but that it also did so more consciously as it made the world as it is our only real horizon. And this needs to change, not just so...
And again, what's so interesting about this is that this is like Stories of Old, who has been, a terrific channel in terms of storytelling, and always sort of, well, one of the things that you do is you just get accustomed to where everyone is seated in the arena. And I've seen this for a long time, just in our own denominational wars. Everyone's just accustomed to where everyone is seated in the arena. And so the progressives and the conservatives, and they fight and they go back and forth. And what was so interesting about going into Synod 2022 in the CRC was that the progressives just basically assumed the status quo is going to maintain, and we're going to have a local option for this adjusted. We're saying, it's the same sexual ethic. We're just going to make this little tweak over here. It's not a big tweak. It's not a big tweak. It's just a tiny little adjustment, and it just moves us incrementally closer to the eschaton and the way things need to be. And that's sort of we did have a script. And so what is sort of broken in the last 5 years is that with the vibe shift, when Trump was, Aaron Sorkin, who writes that letter in 2016 to his daughters, I can promise you this won't ever happen again. And then in 2024, it happens again. And now suddenly there is no script. What do we do? How do we tell stories? Who are our heroes?
Really, this is a talk exploring the idea of heroes through that metaphor with Star Wars Xandor, and showing what a problem James Bond is today, to ask, well, what do we do about our heroes? So an archetypal hero of the past was the knight, the medieval knight. and the medieval knights. But over years, decades, centuries, because we want heroes, we take a figure from our present who's actually a figure around which clusters a lot of violence, a lot of mental health problems, possibly, and we slowly portray them as heroic. And we did that with a medieval knight. And we've done it through the 20th century, especially post-World War II, really kicked off by the work of Ian Fleming.
And of course, I mean, when Trump is shot at and he rises historically and the bullet misses him, I mean, that's Hollywood stuff.
We've done this with the spy. And in order to do this, we've made them the super spy. Because James Bond has to have, like a medieval knight like Lancelot, in order to fulfill our heroic archetype, he has to be able to go and fight at a superhuman level.
But remember, in many ways, James Bond has the same problem of the Avengers. James Bond is there to do the dirty work. He's the good bad guy. He's you know, the man who killed Liberty Valance. He's John Wayne. And he's going to do the work so that James Stewart can rise and be the senator. He's got to keep the status quo. But what happens when the script ends and even the moderate, liberal, progressives say, we need radical action? Well, wait a minute, that's sort of what wokeism was about, the illiberal radical action, and then, well, we need illiberal radical action on the other side to maintain, and yeah, it's lion country.
And so we have to basically give him superpowers. So in our roster of heroes, we have superheroes and we have the super spy, the spy like James Bond. And so because James Bond is the leading example of the super spy archetype, we've gone back into our, we probably do this every 3 years, the search for a charming, handsome, over 5'11", probably over 34, under 46, maybe, English male sociopath to fulfill the role of James Bond.
Okay, the sociopath is a really important word, because in order for James Bond to fulfill the archetype, he needs to kill and not be bothered. He needs to conquer the woman and not be attached. Now we're going to see why in a minute.
Because this, of course, is the problem with James Bond. I don't think I'm saying anything new here, but it's worth expressing again and again and again that James Bond isn't just the baddie. He's obviously portrayed as the goodie, the hero, but...
Now, again, there's a sense in which James Bond is the good bad guy. And the good bad guy is a role, but the good bad guy is never... He's always a particular hero. And this is where sort of the hero thing breaks down, because what we actually tend to have is a constellation of different heroes, and we tend to look upon them and identify with them at different times and in different ways. But Damon's about to make a really important observation here.
In every way we could really talk about a human being, he's a terrible, he's the worst kind of human being. He's a psychopath, pure psychopath. He's willing to kill at a moment's notice. He's a sociopath. He's willing to make use of any weakness in the world, the society, and people's psychology in order to exert power and get...
But now again, if you go back to like stories of old, and he was recognizing that, well, these ascendant heroes, in some ways, there are good bad guys that, you know, they're going to kill the emperor in order to restore justice, and we're going to give back to a senator. But is that really the hero you want to be? Is that the hero you want your son to be? Where are the women heroes? Again, Palm Royale Apple TV Plus fascinating story about the competition in the shadow matriarchy.
What he wants. And we excuse this somehow with the idea that James Bond is on our side, especially if...
Again, that's why if you'd say, well, let's have a movie about either a Japanese or a German super spy during the war that foils an Allied mission to, let's imagine that Jimmy Carter's errand in the desert when he was going to save the embassy hostages was foiled by an Iranian super spy. Would we be satisfied with that? In other words, there's always a context around these things. There can't not be.
If you're in the Anglo-centric world, Bond is your hero. I can assure you, James Bond isn't a hero for many people around the world. I remember going to see...
And that, of course, is a marketing problem because, well, movies make a lot of money in America, but if they can also sell in India and China, even better. And we'd be naive if we didn't think that shaped movie making.
The movie True Lies, which is a Bond derivative, of course. And I went to see it at the time with two Muslim friends. We're all in our early 20s at university together, and we all enjoyed the movie, but they said to me when we came out, yeah, it's just another James Bond killing Muslims. Which is, of course, a major issue. If we think about Casino Royale, arguably the last good Bond movie, Bond made sense to some extent in the 60s and 70s and maybe a little bit in the 80s, but Bond has really been a dead franchise for a long time.
Why? Again, we're looking at these stories and how these stories live and how they have lifespans and lifetimes and how they can be renovated and rearranged but they have to be rearranged.
But there was at least one really good Bond movie in Casino Royale because they did some of what we're going to be talking about in terms of reinventing the character in that movie. But then the producers, the franchise owners, chickened out from doing it anymore. So Bond went back to being a fantasy. So we have to wonder, what is Denis Villeneuve going to do?
Now that fantasy point that he's going to elaborate on is a really important one, because we sort of have this demand arose of film that they represent, because film, of course, has a way, it has a religious quality. Film gives us a sense and whispers to us about what is highest. And so then we judge film and we judge the heroes and we judge the characters according to what we already believe is the highest. So when you have a decidedly post-war consensus speech coming out of an ancient Roman's mouth, we don't think a thing of it because that's what's highest.
With this franchise. And the reason I think it's interesting that Denis V has taken it on at all is because Denis has a really long history. You can think about movies like Sicario, where he's taking on the character of a hitman who's working through American secret services and presenting the implicit conundrum of that character, that this is an evil character in a very evil world. And of course, this is...
Okay, but again, the good bad man.
What Denis V did with Dune. This was in Frank Herbert's Dune. Herbert wanted to explore the false messiah, but he created a hero who was still fundamentally a hero and you were able to like. And Denis V pushes Paul Atreides, Paul Muad'Dib, right to the edge of that envelope. His whole idea with the character is to make him both heroic and psychotic, psychopathic, and sociopathic. All of the dark...
And of course, Muad'Dib is willing to use the nukes.
triad personality disorders manifest in Paul at a certain time. So I think this must be what Denny V is interested in Bond. We're going to see in Denny V's Bond a character pushed again to the end of that envelope. So during the auditions for this character, that search for the charming, tall English sociopath, Matthew Good, I think, said he was dismissed from the audition just after explaining what he'd want to do with Bond, which is make him a self-hating, woman-hating alcoholic who hates everyone and is just incredibly violent. And I think...
And of course, no. Probably not.
I think you could still believe in this heroic James Bond archetype right up until the mid to late 1990s and those classic Pierce Brosnan movies. And when you see Pierce on a speedboat exploding out of the side of MI6 headquarters, and of course not only do the MI6 headquarters rather resemble the ISB headquarters in Andor, but these two organizations, both security agencies for empires or former empires headed by a still at least greater people or story with the ISB action.
Got to get up to the fantasy.
Because of the influence of Tolkien, and we've attached that word fantasy to elves and goblins and dragons and magic and all of that malarkey. But a much more fundamental definition of fantasy comes from Sigmund Freud, famous father of psychoanalysis, and that fantasy is about fulfilling our frustrated desires. A schoolboy stuck in a stuffy schoolroom having a daydream about being James Bond is actually fulfilling a fantasy. And
of course, if you go to the rest of history and you look back at Ian Fleming and what he wrote out of, frustration. And the frustration is sort of a wish that, well, what if the constraints weren't on me? What if I could do these things? What if? But when you sort of blow this up to the larger level, the impotence and the ending of the storytelling is sort of where we're at. Well, what if? Well, you can have Imagine. You can have that song. Imagine there's no, imagine there's no, imagine there's no. People have noticed for a very long time that actually what most people tend to focus on is this. This is a bad thing. This pinches. This hurts. This causes suffering. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. But in order to construct something new, to construct something good, and so when you get to this talk with these two, well, again, even towards the end, you're going to sort of devolve then into Antichrist. We devolve into the fears, and even the shape of the post-war consensus, even the shape of what the Collinses call the urban monoculture, that tends to be, again, negative utilitarianism. Well, we want to avoid suffering. We want to avoid suffering. We want to avoid suffering, which, again, sort of comes into, Peter Thiel. Well, we've been doing too much avoiding suffering. And when it comes right down to it, the low-hanging fruit of the problematic previous regime, which sort of goes out in the counterculture, well, after we've sort of equalized men and women, and we've equalized the races, and we've tried to equalize how many other things, well, and now we have drugs not to suffer, well, what does actually the future look like? What is the good? It's fundamentally a religious crisis. It is fundamentally a religious crisis. That with the end of the Second World War, we have these horrible visions of the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the sacrifices by the Germans, and then of course, and Jonathan Peugeot is very right. We just sort of don't think about Stalin or Pol Pot, and we enjoy our fruits of the apple with a bite out of it, not thinking about the slavery that is happening in this strange Chinese industrial. And, well, now it's just all sort of about fighting the other side. We haven't been able to stream our church services on Facebook, and the church Facebook account is tied to my Facebook account, and I never go on Facebook anymore. And so I had to go on Facebook to get the church computer onto the Facebook account, and I went to Facebook, and it was like, oh yeah, wow, I'm seeing the life that I've just lived for the last 3 weeks through a whole set of other eyes, and people are upset, and we have all these battles of giant spirits, this war that is in the heavenlies. I don't know how much time I'll have. I've got another video in mind. I don't know if I'll have time to make it today, but maybe another day of sitting on it will help. But yeah, it is a religious crisis. Even though, well, it's a question of heroes. And it's a question of stories. And James Bond makes for such an interesting one because, again, we did all of these backflips to avoid all of the problematic things we had before.
And he does something similar with those Bourne scripts, which is an inversion of values to take us back into reality. So Bond, and is it Roy Ludlam? Well, the Ludlam books, and you'll often see Matt Damon talking about this. He's very proud of the fact that they inverted the values of those books. So Bourne in those books, he is a super spy, brainwashed, but he's fighting for the good. Whereas in the movies, he's fighting against the agency, against those imperialist, colonialist powers who brainwashed him. And that's a very smart answer. And I think fundamentally, the Bourne movies, when they were good, because it takes a lot of skill in writing to keep them at that level, and I think after Gilroy and others departed from the franchise, that skill was lost and they just tried to turn it into action movies. Obviously, those amazing fight sequences, which were really a whole new...
All right, but again, we've done the inversion, and the inversion didn't work. And this sort of lands into Peugeot's lap with, well, let's start at the bottom level. Let's start with the fairy tales. Okay, where's this going to take us? Do we have another story? And to go earlier back in the like stories of old, part of this was sort of when you bring the stories all into this world, you just have a limited canvas. So then they've tried doing the multiverse, but it's fundamentally a religious crisis. It's fundamentally a religious crisis, which I think is why you have this movement.
I think, first of all, I totally agree with you, Paul. I think that, if we look at the sacred events, let's say, or the sacred moments and sacred spaces that have created our time now, I think of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and I think of the Holocaust. Like, those are things that I think of in the sense that they are massive human sacrifices that have founded the modern, like, let's say, post-World War II state. And the entire world order is based on those events. All our narrative, everything we say is all based on those events. We still, even today, like even Trump being elected is deeply ingrained in these sacred, let's say, stories. And so I completely agree, and that's why I present it as a kind of gray thing, like that the idea that the sacred is returning. It's both, it's like George Floyd was a little eruption of the sacred. It's like here's a fast where everybody is locked into their house, a human sacrifice, and then an ecstatic explosion. It's like, oh, yeah, yeah. Not sure we want that. But the thing is that in some ways, one of the things that is happening is that we're also exhausting the story. It's let's say, and it happens just naturally through time with people dying and generations moving away, and some aspects of the story that were also taboo people are trying to talk about it in different ways. And so this is demythologization of the stories is also going to happen of that sacred origin. And so we can see attempts at that now. We can kind of see it happening. We can see this poke. And so it's calling for another foundation. And so I agree that there's an aspect of it that is absolutely terrifying. But the problem is that it's going to these things are going to happen. Like there's no like for example, like this weird desire for World War III, like this weird longing and dreaming of nuclear war at this moment, with a mix of fascination and terror that we can see in the eyes of people that keep talking about it. It's like that's a longing for the sacred too, It's a longing for something that will just set things right. Like it will make everything clear again, because now everything is muddy and nobody knows where they are and nobody knows what to think and nobody knows. It's like a good war, let's just put everything in place. And so these are all things that are happening, and they're all things that are very frightening. And that's why I keep harping on the fact that I think the way that Jordan presents it, is deeply a Christian way of thinking of it. It's like the cross replaced this with self-sacrifice. It is the sacred, like it is both the ultimate sacred and the disarming of the sacred, right? In the way that René Girard talks about it, but then also, I think in a way that Girard misses, because it is still anyways, there's something else going on in Jesus's cross that is not just a disarming of the sacred; it's a refounding of it in a way, in a deep way. So I think that it's weird, like the only solution to avoiding a sacred event in the big sense is to enact it personally in a small way, almost like a kind of diffusion mechanism, like where we enact the best aspects of the sacred in our lives and our families and our communities, and that can prevent the need for a new sacred foundation, which will be bloody. Like there's almost no other way for it to happen. Like, so I mean, you could imagine something. I mean, it could be something else. Maybe that's why Elon Musk wants to go to Mars, because he's looking for a sacred event. He's looking for something to refound us, something to give us a new direction, a new purpose. Maybe that's all these things are kind of bubbling up at the same time. But I agree with Paul that we cannot forget the what the sacred is and how it manifests itself.
That's not Nazism. I don't know what it is. Whatever it is, it's not Nazism, but it's like a weird, paradoxical, contradictory thing that is just bubbling up, through I always see him as a kind of a tuning fork, right? He just starts to vibrate in the shape of the culture, you could say, And I knew, like, when Kanye converted to Christianity, quote unquote, now at this point, I was like, oh, wow, I guess we're going to see a bunch of Christians now. And that's what happened, right? All of a sudden, you had this wave of Christian people, like, coming into the church. And then when he started playing with, like, Nazi imagery, I was like, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no, yay, come on, man. But that's, and in some ways, that's what's, it's like, like I said, it's just kind of happening,
So when you talk.
So where are we going? Where are we going? What's going to happen? What's going to break? Where's this heading? Well, I think it's going to go sort of back to the sources is what we usually do. And then we continue to build from there. But it will be different. Leave a comment.
Still I have it. There are moments I conveniently forget that I'm a 40-year-old man. The last vestiges of a ghost long dead. The ghost with a messiah complex. A messiah too lazy to rise or ascend. Happily hurt and hard. A hanger-on or haunting of a time past. A heroic dream of the harrowing of hell. Failure to launch. Cling to a life vest, treading in spells that linger and last. Mom and Dad, righteous and mad, daydreamers with ghosts of their own. My memory of them stoic, looking with aims to pretend. Always on the brink of somewhere. Each a child dancing on the fence. On down the river, dreamt in the sunshine. Saturday morning cartoons, the only Sabbath I knew. A disciple of Jim Henson and John Hughes. Worship in cathedrals where the Toys R Us, baptized in ball pits, a clown served the sacrament we eat. More Pepsi and Pizza Hut. Say please. Say cheese. Between Kurt Cobain, a scrambled cable screen, towers tumbling, Super Bowls, and reality TV, the ghost is constitutionally unwilling and intrinsically unable to see and be seen, searching madly for attention to seek. But you could be anything. Never say never. If you've got nothing nice to say, don't say nothing. Ever. Don't talk to strangers. See what I say. Just do it. You don't listen very well, do you? You don't do very well, do you? You're not looking too good, are you? Keep up. Appearances aren't what they seem. Will you ever grow up? You look like you're stuck. I think you took too much. Echoes the ghost within the host, who prays the dead bury their dead and stay buried in a fading dream.
Midwestuary 2025, August 22nd through the 24th, in Elmhurst, Illinois. A weekend you won't want to miss, with special guests Cale Zeldin, Paul Vanderklay, Rod Dreher, Elizabeth Oldfield, John Vervaeke, and Jonathan Pajot. Midwestuary 2025, the Fellowship of the Spirit. Stay tuned for more details. Visit us at midwestuary.com for ongoing updates.